This is Wendy Halley, and you're listening to Lucid Cafe. Hey, welcome back. If you're a new listener, thanks for tuning in. Or rather, thanks for clicking? Unless you have a radio dial on your device, I guess. All right, I just want to say how disturbed I am with how quickly time is moving. I know I've talked about this before, but it's getting worse. April feels like it was 2 years ago, and yesterday, 5 minutes. How does that work? You don't have to answer that. Okay, so update. The Become Your Own Shaman introductory online course is coming along. I've now completed all the foundational instructional videos, and now I'm creating the videos for the experiential exercises. I'm pretty pleased with how it's turning out. At the rate time's moving, the course will either be available in 2032 or next month. But either way, it'll feel like 10 minutes from now. So if you want to check it out, the best way to find out when it'll be released is to sign up for my newsletter, and I'll put a link in the show notes. All right, so in today's episode, my guest Ellen Evert Hopman shares what she's discovered about Celtic Druidism in her 30 years as a Celtic historian, teacher, and a practicing Druid. Her new book, Celtic Druidry, Rituals, Techniques, and Magical Practices, is a handbook for becoming a modern Druid. In our conversation, she shares how our contemporary understanding of Druidism is not really complete, and you might be surprised to learn about the rather important roles Druids played in ancient society. So Ellen is the author of a number of books and has been a teacher of Herbalism since 1983 and of Druidism since 1990. She's a professional member of the American Herbalists Guild and has presented on Druidism, herbal lore, tree lore, paganism, and magic at conferences, festivals, and events in Northern Ireland, Scotland, Canada, and in the United States. Please enjoy my conversation with Ellen Evert Hopman. Ellen, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Of course, yes. I was interested to talk to you because I don't know much about Druidry. That's a hard word to say, Druidry. Say it 10 times fast. So you just released a new book called Celtic Druidry, Rituals, Techniques, and Magical Practices.
Mhm.
It is chock full of information and a lot of historic information, which I think is great because I think the whole Druid world is probably very misunderstood and maybe not completely accurate, the information that we have. So I would love to start right there. I'd love to hear your definition of what a Druid is and what that practice is all about.
Oh boy. Well, there are many different kinds of druids. There's druids and there's druids and there's druids. We like threes. The number three is very important.
Okay.
But there are people who literally say all you have to do is sit under a tree and hang out, and that makes you a druid.
Oh, really? I'm sure it's that easy, huh?
Yeah, there are people who will tell you that. You say, how do I become a druid? Well, just go sit outside and watch the clouds or something,
Mm.
and that's a druid. But I am what's called a Celtic Reconstructionist Druid. And what that means is that we look to the old teachings, the literature, the wisdom tales, the poetry. There's a lot of material out there. The other thing you'll hear people say is, we don't know anything about druids. There's nothing out there, so you can make up what you want. But that's because they haven't bothered to look. In the book, I tried very hard to give examples of ancient 2,000-year-old poetry and written by Druids and little herb spells that have been passed down. And I mean, there's a lot out there. And I think one of the big problems is that people haven't really looked at the Irish material. People tend to look at the British material. There was a big British revival, English revival in the 1700s, which was brought about by Masons, who were all men, of course.
Of course.
And there was also a French Druid revival, which nobody talks about, at least in America, which they were also Masons. So it was very male, very Masonic. So people think that that's what it is. But if you look at the Irish material, we're very fortunate because we have volumes of books. We have the Laws of the Poets, for example, the Uircech na Rir, which I think every person who calls himself a Druid needs to look at that book because it goes through the bardic training year by year, and it's only 8 years. We know that Druids spent 20 years studying, but in the bardic training, it's 8 years, and it tells you what you need to know each year, how many stories you have to memorize, how many alphabets you have to know, and it goes on and on and on. And it's nothing about sitting under a tree. But what I say in the book is that being in nature is half of it. The other half is scholarship. And that's the half that most people don't want to, they just want to look at their phone.
That sounds like a lot of work. Yeah.
Yeah. But I do provide a list of books, what I consider the basic books for people to read. And I just try to help people on the way if they really want to learn this, because it's a big subject. I've been at it for 40 years and I'm still learning.
I bet. Yeah. Because you're a Druid scholar, right? A
Well, I'm a
practitioner.
Druid.
Yes.
The Druids were actually the intellectuals of the
Okay.
times.
Yes, you did write about that.
Mhm.
Yeah. I just want to clarify that culturally, Druids were part of ancient Ireland. Is that correct? Or,
No, well, we had Druids all over Britain, in Scotland.
oh, okay. So the
Yeah.
UK.
Well, what was called the British Isles, which used to include Ireland, and then, of course, down into to Gaul, which is France, and parts of Germany. I mean, Druids were a class within Celtic society. So they were the equivalent of Brahmins. You know, in India, you have the Brahmins, and they are a sacred class, and people were born into, it's called Nemed, which means sacred in Old Irish. You were born into the Nemed class. The kings and queens came from the warrior class, which is equivalent to the Kshatriya in Hinduism. And they had to be ritually elevated into the Nemed class. That's why you had to have a big ritual. I mean, we just saw that with King Charles. You had to have this ritual to sanctify him, to enable him to be elevated. Even though he was born into the nobility, he had to be elevated, right? And anointed and all that stuff. Well, it's the same thing. The king had to be ritually elevated by a druid. And we even have still some of that ritual. And I do talk about that in the book. It's called the Oidach Moran, which is the Testament of Moran. And it tells, it's a druid telling a king, a young king, a new king, how to be a king. And that's part of the ritual. So the druid had druid parents, usually, or grandparents, and was born into it and was trained by their parents, father and mother. There were female druids, which a lot of scholars have ignored, of course. but
Well,
I
of
found,
course.
yeah, I found plenty of evidence for that. And if anybody's interested, I have an essay. It's floating around on the internet, and it's called Female Druids. So if you just look up Ellen Evert Hopman, Female Druids, it'll pop up, and you can read the evidence that I found. And it wasn't that hard
It wasn't that hard to find it.
to find the evidence.
Okay.
Yeah, it wasn't.
All
I
right.
mean, there's plenty of evidence out there.
I was really intrigued by the comparison between Indian culture
Mhm.
and Celtic culture.
Mhm.
Is that just a coincidence or is
No.
Was there,
Okay. Yeah. I like to think of the old Celtic religion, Druidism is what I usually call it, as being the Western end of Hinduism. Hinduism is the Eastern end of Celtic religion. I mean, it's the same religion. It's part of the Indo-European continuum. That's why the class structure is exactly the same. The idea that cows are sacred, that you make offerings to fire, you make offerings to water. It's the same religion. And well, I wrote a series of novels. If you look up my name and the Druid trilogy, it'll come.
you are prolific. You have written many, many books.
Yeah, I'll keep
A lot
mentioning.
on herbalism and some fiction too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but in the novels, I talk about when the first missionaries showed up in the second century, long before Patrick, and the confrontation between the indigenous Druids and the missionaries. It's three novels about that, second to fifth century. But I do talk about that in there, and I think the essay "Female Druids" is actually in the back of one of those books.
Okay. So it's like historical fiction.
Yeah, although they made me classify it as fantasy because if you have druids, you're supposed to make it fantasy. You're not allowed to make it history.
That's right, because of the misunderstanding
Right,
about
because of Merlin. Oh,
Druidism.
yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's historical fiction, you could call it that. But it's based on when I was writing the books, I had been studying Celtic history for 30 years. I've now studied it for 40 years. So yeah, so there's actual research that went into the books, all my books.
Yeah. And so do you find that a lot of people are surprised to hear the true history of Druidism?
Well, most people don't care about Druidism, to be honest.
Well, I mean, the people who are
The people
interested.
who do care, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah. Okay. That's, yeah. Yeah. I didn't mean like the whole world is like, no shit, really?
oh,
I
right.
had no idea.
Yeah. Um, no, I think, well, I'm very used to hanging out in Celtic Reconstructionist circles, which I've been doing for 40 years. So the people that I associate with are not surprised. But what you typically get mostly with people who come to my talks or people online, you typically get people who will immediately say, we know nothing about Druids. So just make up what you want. That's what you hear all the time. And then I have to constantly go, wait a minute, but
So what got you interested originally in the history of it all?
well, I was born in Austria and my mother was an artist and she was very interested in archaeology and there were a lot of digs going on, and there still are, of course. But they were digging up all these Celtic graveyards and they were finding jewelry and metalwork. And my mother was fascinated by that. So I grew up hearing about the Celts. And what I remember most, and mothers are very powerful when I look back on it, because I didn't think anything of it. But what happened was she would talk about the Celts, but she would talk about them with such respect. That's what I really got as a kid was this respect, this profound respect. And that's what really came through. And I never thought anything about it, and I promptly forgot about it. And it wasn't until my 30s when I heard Celtic music for the first time. And I heard somebody on the radio say, this is Celtic music. And I went, Celtic? Wait a minute. And I just loved the music. I still do. It's my favorite music. But
So that seed that your mom had planted
yeah,
began to sprout.
yeah. And I literally hadn't thought about it. I'd never heard the word spoken out loud, nothing. And then I went to Findhorn in Scotland, and I actually lived at Findhorn for a summer. Findhorn is the first New Age community in the world, and it's in the Moray Firth of Scotland. And I was there for a whole summer. And for 1 week of that summer, I got to go to Iona, the island of Iona, and that was the first time I heard the word Druid spoken out loud because there were stories about the Druids. And again, as soon as I heard that, some part of me just immediately resonated, you know. I
Hmm.
knew it was something.
How do you make sense of that kind of? I mean, I know your mom planted the seed and she had a lot of reverence for Celtic culture, but you seem to have a very strong, passionate connection. Do you have any kind of theories as to why it feels so powerfully strong and why you've dedicated so much of your life to understanding the culture and the practices and what it really means to be a druid?
Hmm. Well, I have theories.
I love theories.
Okay, well, I mean, I've done past, haven't we all done past life regressions, you know? And I remember a 7th century lifetime as a druid. And also for me, Druidism, I haven't really connected with witchcraft the way a lot of people connect to witchcraft, mainly because the witchcraft that I've been exposed to has been modern. It's been Wicca, which was invented in the 1930s. And somehow I'm not built that way. I'm more interested in the old stuff. So if somebody came up with a witch tradition that was 2,000 years old, I'd probably be interested. This is our indigenous history. This is who we are. And what happened was first the Romans came and they did unspeakable things. And
Really? I think I heard something about that. Yeah.
so we had the Roman armies who came in and we had to try to repel that. And then when we finally kicked them out, then along came the Roman Catholic Church. So it's been 2,000 years of misery, on that level, and trying to impose an authoritarian patriarchal structure on top of a forest-based, not 100% egalitarian, but very pro-female compared to the Romans and compared to modern day, like women were actually honored.
Wow, that's a novel idea,
Yeah,
huh?
what an idea. But I mean, that's who we were. We were a forest culture. There was unbroken oak forest from the west coast of France all the way to the Black Sea, and probably in Russia too, but I've never been to Russia. But it was unbroken oak forest. And that's our indigenous state. That's who we are. Even Ireland, if you go to Ireland now, they only have 1% of their forests left. And there's a terrible history there too. The English came in and cut down all the trees, and now you have these corporations who are planting Sitka spruce plantations, which don't belong there.
Ah,
That's an Alaskan tree, and
oh, no
and
kidding.
it
Okay.
kills everything underneath. So all the bushes and the berries and the flowers, herbs that should be, that's all killed off.
Nice try, I guess, huh? I mean,
Well, it's
they didn't do a lot of research on indigenous
Oh, they don't
plants,
care.
trees.
No, they just don't care. It's all about profit. They think of trees as farming. You're farming trees, so you grow them for a certain number of years and then you clear cut. That's the way they think.
I see.
It's just
Okay.
for money. That's all they think about.
Oh, I thought it was the illusion of, see, we're helping the planet by planting trees.
Oh no. Oh
It's
my
a business.
God,
I see.
no.
Okay. I guess that was my wishful thinking.
I mean, there are people in Ireland and in Scotland and in England and all over the place who are trying to plant the indigenous trees back, but it's just little groups of people working really hard against these giant corporate interests. And the government keeps giving the corporations the go ahead to rape the land, basically. But that's the whole,
That's a whole other
that's
conversation.
another conversation. But anyway, yeah, so we're still, the way I look at it is we're still trying to get out from under the mentality, what came in 2,000 years ago. And yeah, it's been bad news ever since, kind of.
Okay, let's get back to the role that Druids played in society. How would you describe the various roles? Because it wasn't just one role, right? It was,
Right,
you already talked about of them being intellectuals and
right,
scholars.
right.
And
They were scholars. They were called the people of arts. In our culture, we have something called a master of arts. It's a
mhm.
degree, right? Well, that's what they were. They were the people of arts. They were the masters of the arts. And so some of them were ritualists. They supervised the sacrifices and rituals. Some of them were sacred singers. Some of them were sacred poets. Some of them were genealogists. Some of them were historians. Some of them were herbalists, what we would call doctors, which was a combination of herbalism and magic. But some of them were judges. Some of them were lawyers. Uh, all the educated people. And then they were the teachers of the children of the nobility. Obviously, they weren't teaching the lower classes, but yeah.
Hmm. I'm probably going to be asking you a lot of ignorant questions, so forgive me in advance, but the way you're describing it is clearly very different than my understanding, my maybe more Hollywood understanding of the Druid,
Mm-hmm.
or the fictionalized version of the Druid that shows up in fantasy books and such. So rituals obviously super important, and I think it's been important in every culture throughout history. How do you see the importance of ritual playing out with the Druids? Like in your own life, do you use a lot of ritual?
Mm. Yeah. Ritual today has the same place as it did in the past, in the sense that it's a way to bring the whole community together. And well, a druid would be working for one king and a tribe. And that's one of the big differences between druids and witches, for example, or cunning folk. The witch is an independent agent and you don't know who they're working for, and therefore they're scary. Whereas the druid is always working for the tribe and they're working for the king, and you know what side they're on. But the rituals, I mean, they had lots of different rituals, but obviously you had things like marriages, marriage contracts, the usual stuff, what we call baptism, baby blessings, that kind of thing, or blessing the soldiers before they go off to war and all that. But also the big seasonal festivals. And in fact, we just celebrated Beltane, which is May Day.
Right.
And for the Celts, there were really only two seasons of the year. There was the dark half and the light half. So there's two New Years. Right now, people are arguing about when is the Celtic New Year. And one faction says, oh, Celtic New Year is at Samhain, which is Halloween. And the other faction says, no, Celtic New Year is Beltane, which is May Day. But they're both right.
They're both.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Gotcha.
And so those are the two big spirit nights of the year, and you have all kinds of rituals that go on. So, for example, for the May Day or Bealtaine or Beltane that we just had, actually, okay, I'm going to backtrack. It's not Beltane yet. I call Beltane or May Day, the way most people celebrate it, I call that the secular Beltane, because the real Beltane is at the full moon, and it's when the hawthorns bloom.
Ah, okay.
And I've been keeping a careful eye on the hawthorns behind the house. And I recently spoke to somebody in Ireland, and I asked them, I said, are your hawthorns blooming yet? And they said, no, not yet. There's just buds. And it's not Beltane until the hawthorn blooms. And the reason is that once the hawthorn blooms, that's the signal that it's warm enough to send the cows up to the hills, because the tree knows. So that's what the druid has to keep their eye on the hawthorns, and then has to tell the tribe, hey, the hawthorns are blooming.
It's time.
It's time. Yeah. So then you have this big ritual, which involves 3 fires. We like the number 3.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one big fire, which was probably dedicated to a male deity, another big fire for a female deity, and then a third smaller fire. So first you have to ritually light the small fire. And that means like holding a crystal to the sun, or gathering wildfire from a lightning strike, or from nature, some natural, or using, well, they didn't have matches, but anyway,
Right.
using some natural fire. You have your little fire, and from that little fire, then you light the 2 big fires, and then you have to pass all the cows through in between the 2 fires. And the 2 fires have to be close enough that a white cow passing through will have her fur singed brown.
Wow, that's intense.
Pretty
Okay.
close. Yeah, and every cow has to go through those 2 fires. And this ties in to Hinduism again, because the reason for this is that the cow is a lunar animal. It's an animal of water because it carries liquid, otherwise known as milk or soma.
Mm-hmm.
And the fire is the opposite, right? Just like dark half of the year, light half of the year, fire and water. Yeah, fire and water. So milk is liquid. You got the fires. So you pass this lunar watery animal between two ritual fires, and fire and water come together. And I talk about this in my novels a lot. But where fire and water come together, you have the greatest potential for magic and transformation. The whole world is made of fire and water in Celtic thinking. In its interest in Scandinavian thinking, they say fire and ice.
Makes sense.
And they had two seasons, a fiery season and an icy season. So at Lunasa, which is Lammas, they call it Lammas, which is actually Anglo-Saxon, comes from loaf mass, but the word is Lunasa. You have fiery animals, which are horses. Those are creatures of fire. And if you read the Rig Veda, there are hymns to horses, and guess what? They're fire animals. So you take these fire animals, horses, and you pass them through water. So you drive them across a river or through a pond or something, because you have to bring fire and water together again.
That's to symbolize that time of year. Is that?
Well, it's magic. Like at Lunasa, which is around August 1st, last week of July, first 2 weeks of August, the crops are not yet in. You're waiting for the wheat harvest or the oats. They're sitting out in the field. They haven't been harvested yet, and they're not quite ripe yet. So you still need magic. You still need good weather. You still need rain. You still need good luck, the luck of the harvest. So you do this ritual act to bring fire and water together to empower whatever it is that you're trying to manifest.
Okay. So is all magic ritual based then?
No.
Okay. Well, can you tell me a little bit about
Oh,
how magic works
well,
in the Druid
there's
tradition?
many different kinds of magic. I mean, you could
Okay.
be a solitary practitioner sitting in your house doing magic. In the book, I have herb magic, for example.
Right.
I even quote some old Scottish writings about that. There are certain herbs that you twine together and you put under your milk pail so that the fairies and the witches won't steal the milk. Um, or you can hang a wreath on the house to protect the house so the fairies won't come in. So, I mean, that's just one type of magic.
So let me ask this question then.
Yeah.
If you perform some magic
hmm
and things didn't go the way you hoped it would go,
hmm
how would Druids explain that?
Okay, so you do a ritual, you set it all up, you make your offerings. We're more into giving praise to the gods and goddesses. That's what we do more. Working magic for a specific intention is rare, but
Okay.
usually we're praising the deities. So we do our big ritual, whatever it is, and then there's always a place in the ritual where you do a divination to see if it was accepted.
Hmm.
Now, back in the day, they would have taken a liver, a nice liver, and they would have cut it open to see what was going on in there. But what we modern druids will use cards or bones or something like that, and we look to see if it was accepted. If the omens are good, then we go, okay, we did our job, that's fine, and then we go eat. you know. But if the omens are bad, that means that we either have to start all over again, or there's something that the gods are asking of us, something that we
And you just have to
we have
figure
to
out what that
figure out
is.
what it is exactly.
Got you. And so is there direct communion with the gods and the
We hope
goddesses?
so.
One of the questions I wanted to ask was any parallels to shamanic practice?
Yes, the Druids were also shamans. That was a big part of it. In fact, see, there's modern Druids, and you see this in Britain, that wear white robes and nice, clean white robes and all that. That's actually Egyptian.
Oh, really?
Yes, because the accounts that we have of the ancient Druids, they wore plaid.
I love plaid.
Yeah, well,
I do. I never would have. All right, so they wore plaid. That's amazing. All right.
well, by the different numbers of colors in your plaid, you could tell what status somebody had.
Right.
Okay, so the king could wear 7 colors, the druid could wear 6, and then it kind of went down from there. So that was your calling card. You didn't have a label or a card, but you wore your plaid, and people knew just looking at you, they knew exactly who you were. The slaves could only wear 1 color, and farmers might wear 2. The young lords who didn't have terribly much property but might be a good warrior, they would get 3 colors. And it just kind of went up from there. But we also have writings that talk about the Druids wearing a cape of feathers. Okay. Now, isn't that a typical shamanic costume?
It certainly could be.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you don't see that in Hollywood usually. Um,
No, you don't. You don't. No. Does that mean they would do things to alter their consciousness and travel to the dreaming
yes,
realm?
absolutely. And in fact, in the book, I talk about different trance techniques, which you can do at home. Yeah, there's a famous poetic technique called the stone on the belly, where you literally go into a dark room, complete silence, complete darkness, wrap a plaid around your head, maybe so that no light comes in, and you don't eat anything, you fast, and you put a huge rock on your belly, and you lie there and you incubate a poem. Now, if you think about this, and I've thought about it, you're lying there with a big rock on your belly. What does that represent? What does that resemble?
Well, pregnancy.
Exactly. A lot of the techniques are about going back to the womb or being pregnant.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Okay.
And even with the harp was the Druidic instrument. If you were a harper, you were automatically given land because you were automatically noble and you had to have land. But there's a ritual called the raising of the belly of the harp. So the sound box of the harp, a new harp that's just been made, you put the strings on, and it takes months, and you keep tightening, 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 and the belly of the harp rises.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, the sound box is a belly. And there's a lot of that.
You think it has to do with just creating, whether it's creating magic, creating connection, creating art?
I think it's very feminine. I think it's
Yeah.
very female. I mean, at Imbolc, there's an old tradition of making a bride doll, an image of Bridget, and putting her on a bed by the hearth. Okay, so it's a bed of straw. And a lot of people think, oh, it's a doll, it's a baby Bridget, isn't that cute? And it's going to attract Bridget, and she's going to come down the chimney and leave her footprint in the ashes, and then we'll be blessed. But when I looked into it, it turns out that back in the day, when a woman gave birth, they would put straw on the floor, and she would lie on the straw. She would give birth on the straw, and you can imagine the afterbirth and the blood and all that. And then this is all very sanitary, they would pick up the straw and take it outside and burn it.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So this Bridget doll, it's actually an image of Bridget ready to give birth. She's giving birth to spring, to the new year at Imbolc. I don't know if I put that in the book or not, but I did talk about some of the other rituals, and they're very feminine. Yeah, it's about being pregnant.
Yeah, that's the impression I got when I was reading your book.
Yeah.
It did feel very feminine.
Mhm.
A lot of the practices and the poetry and the one of the things that really strikes me, which is not surprising at all, is the relationship that Druids have with the natural world, and that they're constantly, it seems, attending to, paying attention to. what's happening in the natural world. Yeah, in relationship with the tree spirits and all of the nature spirits, it seems like.
Hmm. Well, that's what we lost when the Roman Christian religion came in. That's what was lost. Initially, it wasn't lost so much. There was a Christian tradition called the Chaldee, who were Celtic Christians. But then there was a synod of Whitby, and big Christians got together and had this synod, and they decided that no, we can't have that. And they threw out the Celtic church and they forced everybody to become Roman Christians. And
Really, that's shocking too.
well,
Yeah, it's not. It's not.
because
It
what
happened
happened,
everywhere.
yeah, but initially you had the pagan nature religion, which honored the seasons, which honored the trees and the herbs, and the fire was sacred and the water was sacred. And the animals were sacred and the people were sacred. And you had all that. And gradually they melded with the missionaries who showed up. And it was kind of peaceful in Ireland. It was not peaceful at all in Gaul, in France, and Germany. It was terrible. There's a lot of violence that went on, forcing people to convert and
Right.
cutting down sacred trees, destroying temples, the whole thing. It was terrible. So that went on. And initially, there was kind of a melding, and it wasn't so bad because the clergy that was coming in, the missionaries, were intellectuals, and the Druids were intellectuals. So
They had a meeting
they
of
were
the
talking to
minds.
yeah, they were talking to each other. They were sharing stories. They were learned people, and that was okay. But then they were forced to become this patriarchal mindset, which came directly from Roman culture. Roman culture was very patriarchal. And it actually goes against who we were for thousands and thousands of years. And I think we're still struggling to regain what was lost.
Yeah, no, it's very sad.
Yeah.
But then there's people like you who are digging deep and sharing this information, which is great.
Well, yeah, that's what I've been doing for the last 40 years. All my
Yeah.
books, the different Druid orders that I've created or co-created or been a part of, I've just been plodding along, you
Well,
know?
what made you write this particular book now? I would have thought this would be a more foundational book that maybe you would have written earlier in your time practicing as a druid.
Yeah, that's not the way I see it at all.
No?
This book, Celtic Druidry, is an overview of what I did for 40 years. I mean, what I believe to be the essence of Druidism. Somebody who's a new practitioner, they don't know. But I mean, I've talked to thousands of Druids, literally. I've read hundreds, if not thousands, of books and articles and helped to create Druid orders. And so what I did was I just took all of that and distilled it into an overview of what I consider to be important if you're going to be a Druid. And I don't think I could have written that book 30 years ago. There's no way. Because,
As you're talking about it, yeah, that seems very clear. You needed to have all this experience
right.
first.
Plus the ancient literature that I mentioned, I didn't learn that immediately. That's something that I had to learn over time.
So, what do you hope this book will do for folks who are interested?
Well, it's set up so that you can be a solitary practitioner. Most people are. To really be a druid is to serve a tribe. So if you're really going to be a druid, you're really supposed to be serving a tribe. So you have to identify who is your tribe and how are you going to serve them. You know,
Okay,
it's it's not a solitary function, although these days most pagans, most witches, most druids are solitary, which is kind of because we've lost our tribes. We always had tribes, you know.
right. Yeah.
So my hope is that somebody could pick up the book and be a practicing druid, whether they do it by themselves or they identify their tribe and who they serve.
Are there druid schools out there that you feel are doing the practice justice?
Well, yes, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
Well, I founded a group and I was Archdruid from 2014 until just a few months ago. And we now have a new Archdruid, which is fantastic. because I was able to hand it off to somebody else, which is, to me, that means I was successful, you know.
Yeah.
But it's called Tribe of the Oak, and you can find us at tribeoftheoak.org, .org. And we have a training program. So we have a website, tribeoftheoak.org. We also have a public page on Facebook. It's a Tribe of the Oak Druids public forum. We do online rituals for people because we have members all over the world. So people in Ireland, Canada, all across the US, Australia. We've had people in Mexico, Japan.
All right.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think where else. Anyway, we're all over the place. So the only way we can have a ceremony together is to do it online. So we're also cyber druids. But our training program is very thorough. It takes years to finish. You can't just go sit under a tree. But I think the quickest, well, I did have one PhD student who did it in 1 year, which was astounding. But most people take, I would say, at least 3 to 5 years to do we have a very large reading list. And on our website, you can find all the books. So the first thing you do is you have to read all the books. And then you can start your what we call fostership, which is one-on-one mentoring. So it's a process.
Yeah, so you have to really, really want to because it sounds like you're
Mhm.
dedicating yourself to a lifestyle.
Yeah, it's a lifelong pursuit, definitely. And we recently had a scholar in Ireland look at our mailing list, excuse me, our book list, not our mailing list. We don't have a mailing list, but they look at our book list and update it. So the scholarship has been recently updated if you go to the website.
So it sounds like this particular group prides itself on authenticity, honoring the past in a way that maybe
Well,
hasn't
nobody,
always
no,
been
yeah, the Druids didn't write down their rituals. They didn't.
oral tradition. Yeah.
Yeah, it was an oral tradition. So we're piecing it, all we're doing, that's why it's called Celtic Reconstructionism. We're trying to piece it back together. And then there's certain parts of it that absolutely we will not do. We don't encourage people to take heads.
That's probably a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't go in for that. We don't have slaves.
Another good idea. Yep.
But back then,
To not have them, I mean.
everybody had slaves back
No,
then.
I mean
Everybody.
now, not to have them now. It's a good idea
Well,
not to have them
people
now.
still have them
Yeah,
now.
I know.
Yeah, but we discourage that. You know, so there's certain things we don't do, obviously, and we are not advisors to kings. But if you're a druid, it's perfectly legitimate to have strong political leanings and fire off letters to political leaders because that's a fine old druid tradition. You could even say to them, I'm your druid and this is what I think, you know. But
Yeah, I'm trying to imagine how that might go over. Yeah.
not too well. But
Is there kind of in the same vein, are there strong ethical guidelines that anyone in the practice adheres to or agrees to adhere to?
yes, we have the laws, the old tribal laws. They're called the Brehon laws. Thankfully, we have that. It's about the equivalent of 25 law books,
Oof.
which in the old days, the Druids would have memorized the laws and they would have recited the precedents. But the nice thing about the laws is they're all about restorative justice.
Hmm.
And that's something that modern lawyers and judges and town councils and whatever, some people are starting to look at that. In Vermont, I think there was even a restorative justice project.
I believe
Uh,
so, yeah. That
yeah.
sounds familiar.
Mhm.
Yeah, I can't remember the details, but
But if they want to see how it was done 2,000 years ago, because they had century after century to figure it out, you know?
right.
And that's what it's all about. It's about the basis of the law is restorative justice. So if anybody's a lawyer out there, look at the Brehon laws, Brehon, and those are the old tribal laws. And I think you will find them very interesting.
Hint, hint, hint. Huh. So, do you find that a lot of people are drawn to these practices despite the amount of dedication it requires? Or do people find out what it really entails to do it authentically?
When they find out that Druids were scholars, they usually run away screaming.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was wondering.
Because they don't want to read books. And I've watched this change. I mean, I've been doing this for 40 years. So when I started out, there was no internet. Finding information, the only thing you could do was go to the library. And then eventually, if you got really lucky, you discovered that there were pagan gatherings. And so you would travel 10 hours to go sit with somebody and listen to them talk, and you would have these big discussions around the fire. And gradually we learned about books. There were certain books out there, and everybody was hungry for it. But then the internet came along, and smartphones and TikTok and things like that. And then people didn't want to read books anymore. So now,
That's a thing, yeah.
yeah, it's like pulling teeth to get people to read books. And they think that all they have to do is go on TikTok and find a druid or Google something
Yeah,
and they'll,
Druidry in 40 seconds or less.
yeah.
Yeah.
And anything more than that, I've had people actually tell me, they say, I want to be a druid. I want to study with you. And I'm like, okay, well, here's the first thing you have to do. You have to read the books. I don't want to read books. And then I, and then I had somebody tell me, actually, two people now have told me, what you should do is you should take all the books and book by book, you should make videos of each book. And then we can watch the videos. That's what you should do.
Yeah, well, thank you for that suggestion. Yep.
Yeah, right.
We'll put
Like,
that in the
yeah, sure.
suggestion box.
In my spare time, I'll
Yeah,
spend
that'll
hundreds
be
of
to
hours
make your
so
life
you,
easier. Yeah.
yeah, so you don't have to read a book.
Yeah.
But I mean, literally, people have literally said that to me.
Well, yeah, it's unfortunate because I mean, any practice it requires discipline, especially a practice like this, because I think maybe people just get eager to jump to the good stuff.
Well, they want the title. They just want the
They want the
title.
title. Okay, I thought maybe they
Yeah.
wanted to get right to the ritual and the magic and healing and
No,
no, they
they
just
just,
want the title. I'm a druid. Well, you can call
I'm a
yourself a druid.
druid.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anybody can call themselves a
That's
druid.
what I
But the
mean.
thing,
Yeah.
but when they do, when someone says, I'm a druid, you say, okay, who did you study with? How long?
Right,
You know,
right. Yeah.
what have you read? What have you studied? Where have you traveled? Who have you met? Ask a few questions.
Yeah, I think that's true. I have a shamanic practice, and I think that's true of shamanism, as like the general shamanism.
Hmm. Well, in the book, there's a section, I don't know exactly where it is, but I talk about their shamanic techniques. Some specific druidic magical techniques, crane magic, where I talk about standing in the posture of a crane on one leg with one arm
That's
extended and
right. I
one
was
arm.
looking at that. Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's seeing, how to do a seeing. The most important part, by the 8th year of Bardic training, a seer was expected to have mastered three skills: Imvas Feroshne, or illumination between the palms, and Dihedal Doshene is a spontaneous uttering of poetic prophecy using the tips of the fingers as a mnemonic device, composing and reciting at the same time. Tenem Lida is an altered state brought on by repetitive chanting or singing, kind of like kirtan, where the mind and the body become synchronized to an external rhythm. Yeah, it's just like Indian kirtan.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
No, that makes sense.
yeah,
So this book is an invitation to start having a personal practice.
right.
But
Then
really,
I
if you would encourage people who are really interested to do training of some sort, like with is it the White Oak,
Tribe of the Oak.
Tribe of the Oak. Where'd I get white
Yeah,
from?
White Oak no longer exists. The Order of White Oak went defunct, which is why I started Tribe of the Oak.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, White Oak went from 1996 to 2014. And then when it collapsed, I said, I'm not going to let this go, and
Huh.
In
Okay.
2014, I
That's
started
weird. I don't know
tribal.
why white oak came out of my head,
It
but
because it's in the
oh,
book.
maybe that's why.
Yeah.
All
I
right.
talk about that. I mean, a lot of the lessons and so on were created by White Oak Druids, but the Order of White Oak no longer exists.
Okay.
And but a lot of the people that were in White Oak migrated to Tribe of the Oak, and Tribe of the Oak is alive and well.
Okay. So, how would you say that being a druid has enriched your life?
Well, for 40 years, it's been my life. I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, it's my spiritual practice. I mean, as I go through the year, the season of the year, I'm observing the Celtic festivals. I've been working with Bridget, the goddess Bridget. She's been working with me for 40 years now. I've been a devotee of Bridget. So it's part of me. It's who I am.
Understood. I was just trying to get a kind of a picture of how this life as a druid is different from a life not as a druid.
Well, I've been a druid for so long,
You don't know the, you don't
I don't
remember what
know
it was
what it's
like.
like to not be a druid, but I imagine that to be a pagan in general, if you're really doing it, is to be very close to nature. And to be a druid is to be very close to nature. So I never feel alone if I step outside. Like during COVID, I had no problems. I had no, I kept hearing people saying that they were having all this terrible time. They were alone and they were isolated, blah, blah. I never felt that way because I would look out the window and I would see crows or turkeys. I would go outside and the trees were there, and
Oh, your nature spirit friends.
yeah, I was surrounded by, when I'm in the city is when I feel alone, when I'm walled off with cement and
I'll drink to that. Yeah.
yeah, but when I'm in nature, I never feel alone. So,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I'm very fortunate because I live in the woods in an oak forest, which is the ideal place for a druid to be. Uh,
Absolutely.
yeah, so
Yeah. I think what you're just reflecting on is how disconnected we all are. I won't get on my soapbox about our disconnection from the natural world, but
mhm.
but it's a sad thing.
Well, that again is part of what we lost 2000 years ago when the Roman Church came in and said that God is something unknowable. It's a man with a beard who's hanging out up in the
Off
sky.
planet, yeah. So it takes
Yeah,
our
off
attention
planet.
away from the planet.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah. And then a lot of other things ensued, right?
Right.
Colonialism and ownership of the earth.
Yeah, and the water wasn't sacred anymore. The fire, we feel happy polluting water. We feel happy polluting the fire. We feel happy clear cutting forests. It all comes from that mentality.
I know it's a thing. It's a whole cultural worldview that's unfortunate, and
Yeah.
it's done a lot of harm, I think. All right, so I got on the soapbox a little bit. All right, so where do folks find your book or any of your books,
Anywhere.
right?
Yeah, I have an author page on Amazon. You can see all my books there. I'm on Barnes and Noble. I'm distributed by Simon and Schuster. You can go to Inner Traditions, Bear and Company. A lot of my books are there. The novels are not. The novels are only on, what happened was the novels were originally with a publisher, but they went out of print and libraries and bookstores won't buy books that are self-published. So I ended up, I had never self-published before, but once those novels went out of print, I said, I'm not going to let them go out of print. And I self-published for the first time. So they're on Amazon.
Okay. All right. And you also have a website.
I have a website, elleneverthopman.com. You can also get the novels there,
Right.
but the rest of the books can be found anywhere.
All right.
If you just Google my name, they'll come up, or go to elleneverthopman.com, they'll come up, or go to Amazon, they'll come up, or Barnes and Noble, or Simon and Schuster. Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything that you would like to add that we haven't talked about that you think is important?
Well, one of the things that I always think about is druids and trees. sometimes people who know nothing about Druids, they either think that they are old men with beards or they worship trees. That's what they'll tell you. We don't worship trees. What we see the sacred in trees, just like we see the sacred in every herb, every animal, every element. But I have an expression that I came up with, which is every tree is a church for a Druid. And this is where sitting under a tree is actually very valid because a tree spans the three worlds. The roots go down to the underworld of the ancestors and the fairies. The branches go up to the sky world of the gods and goddesses. The trunk is in the middle world, which is where we are.
Mm-hmm.
So, and this is where shamanism comes in.
Absolutely.
If you want to travel, oak trees are incredibly useful for this. Find an old oak and you can go in about 3 feet up. There's usually almost like a chakra. I think of it, well, a tree is like a straw. It's a green, very thin green straw held up by cellulose. The outer layer is dead, the bark is dead. In the center of the tree is cellulose, which is dead. And it's all there to hold up this very thin green straw. So I think of it as an elevator. So you go into the tree and you can go ride up the elevator into the branches and then out the branches and you can fly to wherever it is you got to go. So if I want to go to Ireland, for example, I go up and then I go out the branches and I fly across the Atlantic and I land on the shore of Dingle, usually.
Why not?
Yes, or you can go in and then go down through the roots and you'll find yourself tunneling through the earth, and that's where the fairies are and the ancestors. So if you want to communicate with them, you go down. And that's why when you make offerings for ancestors or fairies, you put them on the land. So liquid offerings that go down, or you make offerings to water, which takes it down, or you leave offerings on the land. But if you want to make offerings to the gods, you put it in fire, which takes it up to the sky world. Okay, so depending on who you're communicating with. So all you have to do is have a tree, any kind of tree. Oak is ideal, but any tree, even a little tiny tree. I like to think that if we're on Mars, people ask me, well, what happens if will there be druids on Mars? I've been asked that. And
People
absolutely.
ask that question, huh?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That's a weird question.
Right. But okay. So what they're asking is this only connected to the earth? No, it's the three worlds, it's three directions.
And you can
That's
access them from any planet.
exactly. So you could be in Mars, sitting there
Hanging out with
gathering.
Elon Musk. Yep.
Yeah, and there's this little tiny 6-inch tree, maybe in a pot even. And you sit in front of it and you're in church.
Okay. Well, I'm glad that you solved that for the folks who are concerned about Druidry practice on Mars. That's good. Nice work. Huh. All right. Well, Ellen, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me.
Thank you very much for inviting me. This was fun.
All right, so now you know that becoming a druid is a little more involved than sitting by a tree. If you'd like to learn more about Ellen's work and her books, there's a link to her site in the show notes, as well as a link to learn more about the Tribe of the Oak. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your lovely reviews and feedback and donations to the podcast. I am truly grateful. The next and final episode of Season 6 will feature my old friend and 2-time podcast guest, Linda River Valente, who will share with us her astrological take on the upcoming year. Unsurprisingly, it's going to be a wild ride. Well, I hope the rest of your day is a really good one. Until next time.